An exceptional young man with a lot of knowledge when it comes to ISO 9001 and 14001. For those of you who were with us in the very, very beginning, back in 2005, was that when you started with the Streets Department? 2005, when we first implemented Streets Department. Robert took me under his wing and learned me everything he knew about ISO 9001, 14001. So with that, Robert has been successful in his own business. He's a joker. He loves to have a lot of fun. And I think you'll find this presentation very enjoyable with Robert presenting it the way it is. It is called Leadership Through the Eyes of ISO 9001 2015 and 14001 2015. This is the opportunity to ask an expert. You hear it from me all the time, but Robert is here to address any questions that you might have in regards to the new system. For those of you who haven't seen his flyer, I'm not going to read this to you because Robert's going to tell you about himself. Gives you a little indication of what Robert's been doing these past couple of years and many, many times before. So with that, I'm going to sit down here and enjoy Robert as he brings some new information to you in regards to how you can put together your management systems and help your management understand what your management systems are about and what their role is in the new management, not the new management system, but in the new standard. Okay, so if you got any questions, you can ask him as he goes along, as he'll tell you here, or wait till the end. We got nothing but time today, okay? All right, thank you.
All right, so let the games continue as we work our way through it. So, as Georgie pointed out, the type of training I do is what would be referred to as education. Okay, meaning I'm going to teach you some things, and I'm going to burn some images into your mind, including the one that I've got going on right now. So, yes, I am in waders at this particular point, and my shirt is the same as Herman's House of Fish, basically where I got that from. Just to kind of take you a little depth into the sick, twisted mind of Robert Freeman, I actually got this shirt while I was working with a client in Oregon. So I went to a fish hatchery, and as a result of it, one of the things they had was this shirt. And on the back of the shirt I'm wearing right now, it says that Herman's House of Fish, quality you can smell. Okay? And then it says discount seafood, previously fresh. And the interesting thing for me about that, as it relates to 9001-2015, is that when you look at the standard and you look at what the direction of the standard is at this particular point, much of what you're faced with is what organizations are having to deal with regard to quality, not just from the standpoint of a quality management system, but even on the environmental side of things. Okay? So from the standpoint of the structure of the standard, it really came down to trying to get organizations to that place where they think more about the structure of the organization instead of the components of a standard. Okay? So, and to kind of give you a little background, as Georgie noted, you can read different things in there with regard to me. I am part of the United States Technical Advisory Group for the quality standard. So ISO 9001, ISO 9004, those types of things. I'm also the international expert for the United States on ISO 9004, which is a guidance document for sustained success. So from that standpoint, it doesn't mean that I have more capabilities or skills than people that you might encounter who aren't part of that group. It simply means that when it comes to listening to the discussions or interacting on the things, I'm in that room. Okay? So it's the only real difference. It doesn't make it sound, I don't want to make it sound like I'm some amazing person or something of the sort. It's really more about understanding that it provides a point of reference for the discussions in terms of things. One other thing, I am part of the interpretation committee for the United States with regard to that same technical advisory group. Okay? If you have a question that gets submitted to the tag, you have to submit it in a yes-no form. Okay? Primarily because the people who now implement the standard and those who audit against the standard are tied to the accreditation bodies. Okay, so you have the International Accreditation Forum. Your registration is under a registrar that's associated with or accredited by ANAB. Okay, so ANAB is part of this International Accreditation Forum, and it's the accreditation bodies and the registrars that take the stance on where it's going. And the reason we don't push the interpretations from a United States position is If we do, we basically create the interpretation for the world. Okay, and we're not authorized to do that. That has to come from ISO, from that standpoint. Okay, so when I'm there, I'm actually representing ANSI under those circumstances, but it's all tied through ISO. So, again, talking about this House of Fish or Herman's House of Fish, discount seafood, previously fresh. All right. In that particular situation, one of the circumstances that exists is that you begin to understand the significance of requirements. Okay? In other words, it's how you apply those requirements. So we can all say, let me ask you guys this. So, and if you haven't figured it out pretty quickly, you will. This is an interactive process, meaning if you don't volunteer, I will victimize. Okay? Because I'm going to have fun no matter what. But when you think about the words conformance and compliance, so if you think in terms of ISO 9001, everything in ISO 9001 is a conformance document. Okay? In ISO 14001, it speaks to compliance things. It's still a conformance document, but in 14001, don't forget about the compliance type stuff. Okay? So, what is the difference between conformance and compliance? And if I have to start humming the theme from Jeopardy, you'll have to answer the formal question.
Compliance is by law. Conformance is adhering to a certain set of standards.
Okay, all right, that's pretty good, pretty good. Compliance is a regulatory requirement, so I'm going to expand it just a little bit. Instead of just saying law, it is, because it could be a regulatory thing, which might look law, but it's not. So this is why they talk about things in terms of statutory and regulatory most of the time, or legal and regulatory type. Compliance can also be something that you impose on yourself. You can say, by establishing policy, we will do something this way, period, that's all it is, okay? And therefore, you've made everybody now have to comply with that thing. But for the most part, these standards are conformance standards, meaning this looks like this, okay? And therefore, that's what creates the position that most of us are faced with when we're talking to auditors, whether they're internal auditors or external auditors, in dealing with the circumstances surrounding whether or not something is or is not a finding, whether or not something does or does not address a requirement, okay? The big challenge that organizations have had with regard to 9001-2015 and 14001-2015 is because the standard is so open, the good news is you get to come up with what it looks like, okay? The challenge that also exists within that, and so to some people the bad news is, it also opens it up to more interpretation, more possibility for people to impose requirements because the standard is not giving a little bit more specificity. It's kind of dealing more in, have something that looks like this, okay? So those are some of the challenges that are there, and that's kind of the stuff that we're going to go through as we talk about this thing now. So a couple of things to give you some perspective on that. The makeup of a management system. Management systems are based on closed loop processes. So if you look at ISO 9001 or you look at 14001, in both cases, the standard is a closed loop process. Some things close themselves, okay? Take, for instance, in competence in the standard. It talks about you determining what competence is. Then it says for you to take action associated with competence. And then it says for you to maintain records, or in this particular case, it now refers to them as retained documented information. So it's closing the loop. You start something, something needs to be dealt with, you act on it, it closes. So there are a number of things that have that closed loop process in the way that they're set up. There are other things, though, that don't have a closed loop within themselves and something else closes it. Okay, so if you're dealing with things through ISO 9001, okay, so you're supposed to go out and put in processes or put things in place to facilitate effective activities, and then as a result of that, you're also supposed to verify that they were effectively implemented. So those two pieces of the puzzle aren't necessarily in the same section of the standard. You have to see the relationship of the one to the next one. Okay? If you look in 14001 with regard to emergency preparedness and response, even though the standard has a number of components associated with it, those things won't necessarily all fit together. They deal in pieces of a puzzle. Okay? So that's kind of the way that you have to think about it. But the standard itself, and all of the standards are a series of closed loop processes. Okay? So that's what they're based on. The next thing is, they are models to identify key components of performance. Okay? So the thing I want you to underline there, key components. They're not telling you that the whole thing, nor are they telling you that they're defining that sense of order or direction that you're supposed to follow. They are simply the components or pieces that tie in. Eliminate excuses and drive behavior. Any management system is intended to give you, as an organization, the structure that you need that eliminates the excuses that people might have, both on the management side and the employee side. Okay, so how many of you in here are in a management role? Okay, so if you're in a management role, then it's, I know the first thing that you're thinking to yourself, okay, good, it's going to eliminate the excuses of those. Okay, my employees, all right? But it also eliminates the excuses from a management standpoint, meaning that if you've effectively established what makes sense to you as an organization, they don't have any reason to do something other than what they're supposed to do. And you don't have any reason to go micromanage because you've set the structure in place to make sure that they can and will be successful. Okay, so that's the key to that process. So when we talk about it, the way I want you to think, there are no such thing as excuses. There are realities. The question is, what will you do as a result of it? Because if you let someone off the hook when they provide you with an excuse, you've now accepted the responsibility for the thing that you've said it was okay for them to do. Because that's what ends up happening. Okay? So, that's from the standpoint of a management system. Let's look at the things as it relates to the organization. Okay? So, a similar situation. Organizations are a series of closed-loop processes. So the standard being designed as a series of closed-loop processes is with intent because it recognizes, as an organization, you are a series of closed-loop processes. Okay? Think about the times that we've had a customer on the phone talk about something in particular, and as a result of it, we said, let me put you on hold. After a period of time, if we don't resolve that hold, they hang up and call again. Except sometimes they don't want to talk to us anymore, they want to talk to someone else because as far as they're concerned, there is a loop that needs to be closed. And if our processes don't support that, we can't achieve what we're supposed to accomplish as an organization. All right. Desire to see performance as they plan. Assess what they think will let them tell the performance is to the plan, and then work to maintain stability while pursuing areas needing improvement. Okay, so this is another view, if you will, on a plan, do, check, act. One of the funniest things in going in situations or dealing with circumstances where you're talking to people, even inside the room. Okay, so as I said, there's about there's over 170 of us that are part of the United States Technical Advisory Group. Okay, so in this group, there's 170 people that meet twice a year. And they involve all types of folks. So you got people that are from very large organizations that we're talking about tens of thousands, if not more, some of them over 100,000 employees around the world. And then you got people that are from smaller organizations in varying shapes and sizes and so on. Government agencies, as well as companies that do service, companies that do production, all different types of situations and circumstances. Okay? So in that room, it's always interesting to see when you deal with the people who you're faced with in the organization or in this structure and the types of things that they talk about. One of the funniest ones to me was a guy who was there who, when he was looking at the updates to the standard, he was talking in terms of leadership. He said in the room, and he was from Texas. So where was the guy that had the accent earlier? He's out there, okay. All right, so all I want to hear you say howdy. Howdy. Okay. He's got a Texas accent. I don't understand what he was talking about. All right. So, anyway, in this particular situation, this guy was from Texas, and he said, when they were talking about the leadership stuff, he said, my biggest concern is we're going to have the fox guarding the hen house. Okay? And this was in that room. And all I could think to myself as he said this was, I don't think he understands. The fox owns the hen house. It's his hen house, or it's her hen house. We're trying to help them understand what it takes to be successful as an organization. And that's what's critical in terms of what you're doing or how it plays out. Okay? One of the other things that came into play is, and how many of you are familiar with the term Plan, Do, Check, Act? Okay? If I asked you to truly explain what it means, most of you would come up here, and I'm telling you this not because of you, I'm just telling you based on dealing with people all the time. Most of you would come up here and you go, I'd say, okay, come on up here and explain Plan, Do, Check, Act for me. And you'd come up here and you'd go, well, first thing you do is, well, you plan. Okay? And then, once you've finished all that planning thing, and sometimes you might do a little bit more planning than you do. Okay? When it's all said and done, don't forget you got to check. Okay? And then you act. All right? Got it? Okay. And everybody in the room goes, uh-huh, yeah, I got it. Because you're all afraid to acknowledge the fact that that person didn't tell you anything either. Okay? So in order to help you understand that, I've given you a view or a take on the Plan, Do, Check, Act, and that's what this is. Driven by expectation of performance. That's what you're trying to do. What is the plan? So it's not what are you going to plan, it's what plan already exists. Okay? That's your starting point. What plan already exists? As much as you'd like to think in terms of, let's go ahead and get a plan out there, there's already a plan. The question is whether it's any good or not, whether it needs to be revisited or reevaluated, those types of things. Okay? So what is the plan? All right, so now that we've got that, is it actually taking place? Desire to see performance occur as they plan. All right? Then from there, assess what they think will tell them performance is to plan. Now, the they I'm talking about here is management. For those of you who are in here who are in management, these are the folks I'm talking about. Assess what they think will tell them performance is to plan, and then act, work to maintain stability while pursuing areas needing improvement. One of the things that my company gets involved with quite frequently with regard to organizations is helping them cope with changes that are taking place. Some of them are changes because they're growing too fast. Others are changes because they're not growing. They're struggling. I've had some that were fighting, literally. Just told them that to make sure that if they hit me with something, I couldn't guarantee I wouldn't hit back. Okay? But those types of things that are going on. Most of the time, the thing that causes them to be in the position that they are is actually this last one. They're not working to maintain stability while pursuing areas needing improvement. They're looking at change not based on who they are, but who they think they are, and what they think is actually going to occur as a result of that. Okay? So think in terms of structure when you're thinking about these things. And there's a little take on Plan, Do, Check, Act. So now what I'm expecting is if I ask some of you to come up here, you wouldn't say, well, you do a little bit plan, and you do, check, then act. I'm looking for you. If nothing else, you can stand up here and go, you drive expectation of performance, and you desire to see performance occur, meaning that I want you to think in terms of the depth, don't think in terms of the mantra when you're talking about these things or you're looking at them. Okay? All right. So, and the sound's actually for me, it's not really for you, otherwise I would have put it on the big speakers. It's more, helps me keep going. All right. So, there is no such thing as an excuse, only realities. This is what I was telling you before. The only way to accept an excuse is to assume responsibility for putting a system in place. All right? That's what, when you look at 9001 and what it's really looking for, and 14001, if you're going to say that that's considered acceptable, then put a system in place to cope with the fact that it is, if by chance it isn't really. If you're simply accepting the excuse, then you still have to put something in place to cope with the fact that something isn't going to go right. Okay? People don't give excuses for things that are going okay. All right. So let's talk about the standards themselves. So 9001 and 14001, 18 plus months in, and very few have completed the transition. Estimates to date suggest that less than 30% of transition. On the 9001 side, that number is actually lower. And I don't know what it is today, but at the end of November, early December, when I was in Rotterdam at the international meeting of the different countries and stuff like this, the lady who is the head of the technical committee, the entire technical committee, noted that at that particular point it was 10%. Okay, so the reason that that's a challenge, or the reason it's that way, is because a lot of organizations are struggling with the transition to this open format and moving away from components of a system and now a structure of a system. Okay, organizations seem to be waiting for others to work out their impact. While some of the confusion can be related to the drastic nature of the changes, challenges that the readers are having is this open platform. The standard allows you to do a whole lot more now. That's good. The bad news is the standard allows you to do a whole lot more and nobody knows what that means. Okay? That's the reality that a lot of folks are faced with. Therefore, it's more important to identify and sustain a defensible position. in the past, you had to think in terms of defending a position because the auditors might show up and impose things on you. But you have to continue to think in those terms. Create a position that you believe makes sense to you as an organization. So, in other words, the City of Dallas way. But as you do that, then the idea is to make sure that you can defend that position. Because not doing so means that someone can come in, tell you that you have an issue, you have to go implement something, and now that takes money out of your budget. Because you got to pay people to do it, and it may cost you to implement or institute things that you didn't have planned for in the first place. Sometimes it makes sense to do those things, but there are a number of times it's because people don't understand what you're trying to accomplish in the first place, and they're not looking at the evidence of your process, they're looking at the way they feel about it, okay? It's not a beauty contest, it's about effectiveness, all right? Okay. So, I need a victim/volunteer. Once and twice.
Exactly.
I tell you, this is what the funny thing about this is when you're standing up here, you got people that they won't look at you. You got other people who will burn a hole through you, like, you know, it's that Clint Eastwood, go ahead, make my day kind of thing. Okay, all right. So then you started earlier, so come on. All right. So when you think about the standard, the way I want you to think of it is the standard. If you broke it down into 3 pieces, and if you want to write this down, you can. Competence, definition, and control. In other words, for every activity that you have, it's really about running your processes through a thought of competence, definition, and control. Those are the 3 things that are associated with you as an organization. Okay? Competence, let me say this real quick and then I'll. So competence is someone's ability to do that thing. Okay? Definition, procedures, work instructions, those types of things. Controls, you've made it so that they can't do it wrong. Okay? If we're talking about your call center and they have to put in certain fields inside that system and they can't go without doing those things, including classifying things, you've now given them controls. So the degree that you need competence, definition, and control are relative, they're not absolute. Meaning that the way most people implement it is they go, I got to work out my competence thing. Okay? So as a result of it, I'm now going to address the requirements and the standard for competence. You guys ready? Here we go. Ooh, ooh. Man, I'm so glad I got that competence thing done. We're good to go. Okay? Now I got to do definition. You ready? Here we go. Okay. I wrote all the procedures I was supposed to write. We're good. All the procedures. Have no idea whether or not competence and the procedures have any relationship or they work together. Doesn't matter. I did this one over here, I did this one over there, okay? Now it's time for control. Yeah, it's all about control. Ready? Here we go. I got control under control. All right?
But I have it control over here.
You have it control over there.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the things that comes up, is that people do that whole thing. I have it under control. Okay? But they didn't do it in relation to the procedures or the procedure/work instructions and or the definition. Okay? So the way I want you guys to think about it is if you were looking through a kaleidoscope. Okay? So if you thought in terms of the kaleidoscope that's up here, there are those 3 things. Competence, definition, and control. Okay? And I'm going to talk about the different pieces of the puzzle in that. But the thing is, I want you to continue to think in terms of being curious. Okay? So this is a Curious George kaleidoscope. Is what it is. Okay? So just like this, if you were looking at any kaleidoscope that you had, so I want you to look through that and I want you to turn it until you find the picture that you enjoy. You think, that's it. So turn it until you got it.
Not much to choose from. Okay.
All right, so you got the picture. So now, as a result of it, you've made a decision about the relationship of the chambers that exist inside that kaleidoscope. Okay? And that position will hold true until something changes or something happens. That thing could be you move the kaleidoscope around. It could be you set it down. It could be the way that you're looking through something. So, in other words, the view that's beyond what's in the chambers can also impact what's happening within the kaleidoscope. So much in the same way, instead of looking at things from the standpoint of just competence by itself, just definition by itself, or just control by itself, it's actually the relationship of those things and where they blend. So just like this, talking about blending competence and definition, and competence is based on process, details, or definition. It's about looking at your processes relationally for those components instead of saying, I've covered competence, I've covered definition, I've covered control. Okay, you can take that back with you. It's got on it. There's the illustration that Stephanie's talking about. There are the instructions. I know it might still end up in some child's hands, and that's okay. That's why it's still sitting, okay? But the idea is I want you guys to think in terms of being that curious. When you think about any activity or process that you have, to what extent have you figured out the level of competence that you either need or can acquire? Because sometimes you need more than you can get, but you can't get it. People aren't available, the budget won't allow you to get it, those types of things, all right? So as a result of it, you have to cover the balance of that through the procedures or work instructions that you do, and now competence becomes a factor with regard to people being able to understand that thing. And if that's also a factor, now you go the control route. They can't do it wrong because you've given them something or established some control, which could be inspections, okay, or testing type activities. It could also be that they follow the procedure and you check on them based on that. And it could also be flags within systems that keep you from doing something wrong. Okay? So in this particular thing, the main thing I want you to get out of this is you could base your entire thing that you're trying to address, whatever the activity is, on competence. You could base the whole thing on writing a procedure and then training people to that procedure, at which time they don't have to be able to read the procedure because you rely on someone else to do the training to that procedure. Okay? So it's always a possibility. And then control. You don't worry about procedures or documents because the system that they have to follow is it. So long as they're competent enough to read the screens or recognize it when lights flash that they need to stop, you've established what's necessary to create that initial point of reference for them. Okay? So a couple of things on that. Yes. Reason it's a twilight zone is the kaleidoscope effect. Think in terms of the kaleidoscope, considering all and applying each as needed. May be different for some processes or activities, so consider the kaleidoscope each time. Don't look at everything in your area and say, remember what I was showing you, don't go competence, and definition, and then control. Think in terms of this one and go, what is the competence, definition, control relationship? Now I know I've got things covered, okay? This is what I meant when I was talking about the standard being this more open format. And then the last thing, you're only finished if the process or activity never changes its dynamics. Sometimes you started a process with someone who is a professional engineer. They retire. You're going to replace them with someone else. Are there things that they know that were part of their education or their experience that you no longer have? Quite frequently, people talk in terms of, that person retired and we had to replace him with 3 people, okay? I will tell you, most of the time, as somebody who goes in and evaluates these things, most of the time you didn't need 3 people. It's that you didn't really know what they did in the first place. So as a result of it, and because you're in damage control mode, you put more than one person on it. And then afterwards, instead of trying to see if you can narrow it back down to what that one person was doing, you simply give those people additional tasks. And that's how they end up with one person was replaced by 3. Okay? Quite frequent. All right. A form of risk-based thinking.
Good question.
Good. All right.
Is the competency, definition, control, is that just a linear way of looking at it? Could you do definition, control, competency?
That's it. Okay, good. That was good. It's not tied to one of them in particular. You could start with control. So it's really about evaluating each of your processes and determining which one do I have. That one is very control based. So it's really, that's why you're starting by looking through the kaleidoscope. Which one is there? And the picture you're picking isn't because one chamber you're going, there's my competence chamber, let me line that up. There's my definition, there's my control. I'm looking through this kaleidoscope to evaluate that process and make a decision about that process. What's the starting point for what's already there? Okay? And if you're doing something new, if it's a new process or activity, then don't think in terms of what's already there. Think in terms of what will you be able to get? What's your budget going to allow? How are you going to cope with the fact that you have certain types of people, whatever it is, because the unemployment rate's low, different stuff like that. Okay? So very good. This Olympic moment was brought to you by. All right. So here is I'm taking you very far into that sick, twisted-minded Robert Freeman. Here is an illustration of ISO 9001 and ISO 14001 if you were going to take the standards and put them into a single page to understand the relationship or how they fit together. Okay? So if you're looking at that page, and you probably look at it more closer on the page that you've got. If you look, and let me say this, one of the things that's always interesting in organizations, even if they started with the development of a management system using a standard other than the quality standard, okay? All that the quality standard is a structure for contractual obligations, okay? The contractual obligations, even in a service entity like you are as a city, you still have contractual obligations. They're the things that the council appropriates funds for you to go out and perform based on the services you've agreed to establish and maintain. Okay? So it's not any different than if we were talking about a company that manufactured a component or a piece of something. Right? It's the same thing, same song, second verse. Right? So with that in mind, most of the people, so instead of looking at ISO 9001 and 14001 from the standpoint of 4.1, okay, so if you guys don't know, the section you actually start with is 4.1. Okay? There is stuff in the beginning, but that's really more about helping you understand the nuts and bolts of the standard. Where you actually start when you're dealing with the standard is 4, and where you end is 10. So that is the requirements section. Okay? So in the midst of this requirements section, and when you're looking at this thing, if you'll notice, these clauses are not in the order of the standard. Because the standard wasn't written for you to be in a structure that's tied to, or let me say it this way, the standard wasn't written to define a structure for you. It was written to establish a platform, something that you could build your platform off of. Okay? In other words, you function as an organization already in a platform. Depending on what department you're in, you have a situation where you provide a service. In some cases, you're waiting for somebody to contact you to provide that service. So sometimes you're just providing the service because it's part of a cycle or a series of events that just keeps happening, and it just keeps moving along. You deal with the feedback or information that you get along the way, but your focus isn't on that stuff. You're trying to avoid getting any of those things. Okay? For others, you're waiting for someone to call, and as soon as they do, you act on that particular thing. Okay? So in this particular structure, this is just dealing with, and the clauses that are in there will give you perspective on each of the things that go on. So the first one is establish leadership and their commitment, as well as customer focus if you're 9001, organizational knowledge if you're 9001, okay? And then you can see the clauses that are listed there. The 9001 clauses, 5.1, 7.1.6, and the 14001 is 5.1, okay? So while the standards themselves have been developed to fit together, what you're seeing now, if you look at 9001 and 14001, they're following a similar structure because that was one of the edicts that came from ISO above the different technical committees, okay? So 14001 is Technical Committee 207, 9001 is Technical Committee 176. At the level above that, at ISO at the top level, okay, they came to the place where they said, we're going to establish what's known as Annex SL, which is standard language. So that's why the standards look similar now, where in the past they didn't have that type of structure, okay? But you can see, establish the organizational context and scope. If you look at the standard, if you look at either one of them, okay, so the first piece that it talks about is context. The second thing it talks about is interested parties. And the third thing it talks about is scope. For most organizations, you need to figure out what your scope is before you look at your interested parties and your context. Okay? In other words, what's the scope of your organization? What is it that you're doing to make money, to provide services, whatever it is that you do?
And when you talk about scope in that context, you're talking about a department scope or an organization scope, in this particular case, the city of Dallas.
Or C, all of the above. Okay? So in other words, you could have an overall scope, but now inside the department you have scope that deals with how you accomplish that thing. Okay? That's i.e. what would be known as strategic direction.
So, the earlier point about the open format, which seems to be a challenge for organizations making transition. Can components of an organization look at this differently and still scope in which you provide your purpose,
Uh-huh.
and you operate within that common scope using the open format, you do things different.
Yes. But, let me give a caveat to go with that. I say yes because you can have a component or an aspect that's relative to you, but you still have a point of reference back to the overall organization. So there still has to be a tie-in to that thing. And if I was trying to do it at this particular point, I may have an overall scope that, as a result of it, all of the other scopes get graded against that overall scope to make sure that you're still in line with that one. Okay? So whether or not you create it where it repeats that scope at each of the subsets, or you simply say where our scope falls under this scope, in our department, it narrows to this. Okay? Both from the standpoint of 9001 and 14001. Because 14001, you're dealing more in terms of boundaries that are structural. In 9001, you're dealing more in boundaries that are relative to services or products provided. In other words, the types of things that you're going to support or produce. Okay? So, in this particular thing, for the most part, the clauses that are listed are just listed in numerical order. The only time I included clauses that are not in numerical order was for emphasis. And one of the ones I was talking about was that one up there, establish organizational context and scope. You can see it starts with 4.3 for 14,001 and for 9,001. Okay, so for the most part, all it is think about this stuff in relation to that. And if you'll notice, the things that are on this side, okay, on the left-hand side, are more of the things that you set up, and after it's set up, it only changes if something takes place. The stuff that moves from here over and up has more to do with your daily activities. Okay, so if you look here, establish leadership, establish organization, identify plan, risks, opportunities, aspects, compliance obligations, identify your resource needs. If you look, and you keep going down, policy, objectives, awareness and communication, you set those things up. And if you look, there's a box around these, not because these have to be done in an order, but this is typically the way an organization would see it, okay, as a thought process. But if you'll notice, from identify resource needs down to establish and plan for and fulfill the policy and objectives, that's content. Establish the management system and its processes, including your emergency preparedness and response, as well as implement document information controls, that's structure. Okay? Once you have those things, you're only going to deal with this stuff if something changes up there. Because you'll simply live this day in and day out. It only changes if something causes it to change. Management changes it, you realize there's a need to change a procedure because something's broken, or you can improve on that procedure, and so on. The activities that are over here are more about actually living the experience day in and day out, okay? So that's what this, when you're looking at this, living the experience day in and day out, and where does it end? Internal audits, compliance review, management review, emergency preparedness and response testing, okay? And then if by chance there's a need to improve, it goes on. And you can see dotted lines here, as needed, dotted line when required for action, okay? And then just so you guys know, the A is simply because I didn't want a line crossing, so it's just a connector between the two, okay? So tonight, when you're having trouble sleeping, grab a copy of the standard, grab this, just take one box, and you'll be asleep pretty quick, okay? At least you'll be there, all right? So that just gives you an idea of how you would look at the standard. And again, just a common view. And the reason that I did this was because there were so many organizations struggling. And I will tell you, about a month ago, I was in Wisconsin speaking to a group, and these people had, some of these folks had 90 sites all over the world and things like this, and they were talking to me about the situations or circumstances they were faced with. And at that particular point, they go, okay, I now get it. I get where it's going, what the idea is behind the structure. Okay? So, work for him, might work for you. If nothing else, it will work with insomnia. Okay? All right. So, standards are a written set of requirements, but not an ordered set. A platform for an effective model, not a pinnacle or a peak to be conquered. Okay? So simply by setting up the system and saying, I've now addressed 4.1 through 10, I got it covered. No, you just answered a bunch of questions. Whether or not it works and the degree that you can show the effectiveness in this open platform will remain to be said. And that's kind of what this next little quote is. The victor only gets the spoils if they are focused on the purpose. Okay? This is that whole, if you think about it in terms of you can win the battle and lose the war. All right, so here are some of those words that are in the standard that are out there.
Photos are being taken.
What's that?
A lot of photos are being taken.
He's got some right there as well. Okay. All right, so management systems. So here's some language issues that a lot of people have had some struggles with. There's some challenges. So leadership, context of the organization, purpose, strategic direction, objectives, policy. Okay. So leadership, and again, these are just my take on those things. So they're not official sanctioned definitions. In other words, you can't go to ISO 9000, which is the terms, definitions, and concepts document, and see these things. So, and when I say that 9000 is applicable to not only ISO 9001, but also to 14001. So if you want to understand concepts, terms, definitions, you go look at ISO 9000. That document is the document for what the intent of each word is, where there was a need to give intent for those words. Okay, and it's vetted on an international level. So sometimes you're going to look at a word, you're going to go, why didn't they split this out? Well, it had to be able to work not only in English, but in other languages. Okay? So, leadership, as it can exist by default, the effectiveness of those who should be leading can impact whether the efforts are driving the organization or those within the organization are simply surviving the experience. Okay? From a 9001 standpoint, the sections in the standard, and 14001 as well, the section in the standard that cover leadership is going to be a bit of a challenge for an auditor because they're going to have to ask you what that means to you. There is no definitive thing as far as working through that particular requirement. So they're going to have to ask you, what is leadership? Okay? They're going to have to reach a conclusion, and in many cases, indirect. Because you might tell them it's just this. Well, it may not be something they can go audit directly, so they would have to go look at certain things to reach a conclusion. Okay? So there's a lot more of that in the standard. Context of the organization. The world the organization lives in or under, also recognizing that it's organic, growing and developing into something with or without direction. Okay, so your context happens whether you manage it or not. Most people, when they think in terms of context, and where a lot of them are struggling, it has to do with what else do you have to live up to within your organization. Okay, so within the city, if you're in water utilities, who's in water utilities? Okay, part of your context involves homeland security. Okay?
Yeah, some of the issues.
Yeah, and as a result of that, your management system needs to address how you're going to account for those things.
We already have.
I bow on your generation. Okay, I can't bow too far, I may fall over these things. All right, so that would be part of your context. So when you think in terms of context, most people, if you're thinking ISO 14001, you already have kind of a context thought anyway, because you're thinking in terms of boundaries. You've got the EPA regulations, the regulations for TCEQ, and so on. If you're thinking in terms of safety, you're already kind of going down that path with regard to occupational health and safety and those types of things. Those things are not context if you're only thinking 9001, unless it has a direct relationship to the product or service that you provide. Okay?
Question on the context.
Yeah.
Because context can be pretty, you know, you can have a lot of issues. You can identify external issues, internal issues.
Yep.
Where do you draw the line? I mean, how?
You do.
You know, from a practical perspective.
My company's practical perspectives, I love it that you've used that. That's very good. Okay. Okay. So the starting point for that actually goes with the first rule of law with regard to the standard. You get to decide. Okay. So as an auditor, and let me tell you this as well. So not only do I do that, technical committee, international stuff, I am a registered lead auditor. So if I'm telling you something, I'm telling you through the eyes of an auditor, taking you into that part of the sick, twisted mind. Okay? You get to decide the context. In the same way, if you looked at the next section of the standard when it's talking about interested parties, relevance of interested parties are based on what you decide is relevant, not someone else. Okay? So you decide relevance, you decide context. In deciding it, if you leave something out, as an auditor, I have to go find the evidence that proves that that creates an issue. Okay, I can't simply say, well, you left this out, therefore I'm writing you up for it. Because you got to decide what context is.
And then do you need to write your decision somewhere and say, we decide, for example,
You-
our leadership, to
Okay.
have something signed?
Here, you should. Okay, the way that I'll know whether or not you did will be based on your scope. Okay, in other words, as an auditor, this is why I was telling you, you look at scope, and then you what's your scope, meaning what do you do, and then what context comes into play as a result of that. What are your internal and external issues? Who are your relevant interested parties? But that relevance is you. Now, you could say, well, then I'm not going to make anybody relevant, and I'm going to make context very narrow. Good. Just recognize that as a result of that, you're now telling me as an auditor, I have to go test it in some way other than through that. And if I find things, you get written up for it. Okay? Meaning I can't say, well, you didn't think about this. If I say that, I now have to go look for the evidence to support how that context became significant or relevant. Okay? Against requirements first and foremost, and then against evidence like customer feedback results, issues that might exist in your corrective and preventive action system, internal audit results, things like that.
See, for example, within our scope, we have 27 divisions,
Mhm.
and we went, I already met with our managers, all the division managers, and we went through these exercises, identify the context. But each one of the divisions, depending on what they do, their context is a little more narrow.
Yeah.
Is a little different.
Yeah.
So when we do the department-wide, I'm going to have them select top 5 or whatever from within their scope.
And you can open it up by giving yourself more, for lack of a better word, brevity. Okay, the reason I say lack of a better word is because it's a lot of it's going to still come back to seeing the relationship that exists between those departments. Okay, so you've got certain departments that, in order for people to work in those departments, they have to maintain a water. Is it water? Is that a certification or is it a license for water?
The operator license.
Operator license, okay. So as a result of the fact that they have to maintain that license, there are certain things that means they live under or do. Okay, so how do those things get put in to the structure? Is it based solely on the facts that everyone has to have this license, and therefore that competence creates the structure that you need? Then good. Then that means that your contextual starting point is the fact that they have to all have these operator licenses.
See, and I'm doing it at different levels. I get the context from the leadership, the
Yeah.
context from the management, and then the context from the core team.
Yep.
You know, so I have it I will get it from
Yeah.
3 different levels, and then we can merge and see
Yeah.
how we will.
And if you want to see it effectively, merge them from the standpoint of trying to identify what the key components of each of them are and how they relate to each other. One of the things that happens within organizations is they don't recognize the degree that they create competing interests within themselves. So if you get a good grasp of context, where you say, what's the context or the reality that they're faced with? And let me say this, don't get lost in between competence and context. Okay, so the example I was giving wasn't the license itself, it was the regulation associated with the license. Okay, in other words, the fact that you have to operate under the requirements of TCEQ, that's context. Okay,
Right.
the application of the context is the license that they have, and therefore you're now saying the way I'm covering that piece of context is through competence. People have to have this in order to do that.
The same department, can different divisions under that department, can they have different contexts?
Yep. Yeah, but always think in terms of how it all fits together, because when it's all said and done, you will lose your identity as an organization if you haven't already. If you don't think in terms of it. That's why this is a leadership thing more than it is just
Yeah.
a
And
statement.
they have to decide.
Okay, so if an auditor comes and probably went to one division and saw we're doing similar things, and he begins to wonder why ours is different, would that be, can we defend ourselves, and that should be
Yeah.
a problem for the
Yeah.
auditor?
It's an auditor's problem. Okay. At a global level, Georgie needs to give you a point of reference for context. Okay, and she can note the fact that it's managed at the departmental level, those things. But now it comes back to you guys from a departmental level understanding that when the things that are our context are ISO 9001, ISO 14001, these EPA regulations, these other operator type regulations that may exist they exist based on service, not on environment, not on safety, but on the service level it has to be. Okay, if we were talking about the police department The fact that that the person has to be a police officer, okay? Meaning they have to have gone through and they're recognized as a police officer. It's not just because someone says, I can shoot that thing, I can shoot a quarter a mile away, nothing like that. So it's that becomes part of your context. So context is the world that you live in,
Yeah.
or the components of the world that you have to live under.
So the department can, at its discretion, define the context. But when the auditor comes in and goes about looking at the system, that auditor can bring into question whether or not that department has done its best
Yep.
job of defining the context.
No, they can determine whether or not you've addressed the requirements of content. It's not a beauty contest. So I've just changed it up just a little bit. But I change it up because it's not, and again, let me tell you this. I can tell you right now because it's already a challenge out there, okay? Auditors are going to come in and say, you haven't addressed enough of the context. You're going to have to push back and say to them, this is the context we defined. Where in the standard do we have to define it based on your expectations?
So the burden of proof is on,
The auditor. The burden of evidence is on you. Okay, the burden of proof that that evidence is adequate is on the auditor if they don't think that it is. Okay, I can't, as an auditor, I can't come in. I'm only looking for what you tell me is there. So if you told me that's the context, I'm looking. If I have concerns, I have to now pursue those concerns relationally. I can't simply say I don't like it. Why didn't you think about this? We did. This is what we decided.
But we have to identify where an auditor can see these people thought about it and here's the context.
Now let me say this. For the city, it makes sense to actually have something that gives some clarity to your context. Okay? For the city, it does, because you've got a lot of departments in terms of what's happening. Okay? From the standpoint of the standard, there is no requirement for a record related to context. It has to be maintained, but whether or not there has to be a record or documented retained evidence of it, because I should be able to see it through your scope. Okay?
Yeah, but our scope is kind of.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at is you can either address it by making your context defined and then use that as a point of reference when you build a scope. And instead of having a scope that's got this huge, thing fits this room, you say there's a scope and its point of reference is that list of context.
Okay.
Okay, you can go that route. But the reason I'm telling it to you this way is I don't want to tell you, well, you better get your context in order. It's not a requirement. Okay? All right. Anything else on that? Okay. So, just something to think about here. While previous versions of 9001 and 14001 didn't openly promote that the management system was always management's system. Okay? You might want to underline that. Management's system. The 2015 version provides clarity in this matter and will help those implementing the management system to recognize the need to establish and maintain a system intended to support and protect management and therefore the organization, sometimes from themselves. Okay? The reason that you build a management system is actually to protect management, sometimes from themselves. Okay? Remember we talked about eliminating excuses? It's on both sides of that equation. That's what it's all about. Okay? All right. What other questions do you have?
So along those lines of thinking of protecting management from itself,
Uh-huh.
how do you get around let me back up. How does continuous improvement change, if at all, this new way of thinking?
Well, first and foremost, you got to understand the significance of risks and opportunities. Okay, so a risk is the inevitability that it is already happening, or there's strong indicators that suggest it's going to happen. Okay, opportunity is looking at it from the standpoint of solely on the basis of inevitability, or opportunity to. So it's opportunity to avoid, or opportunity to improve on, and therefore reap a benefit from the action that you took. Okay, so risks and opportunities. That's why there's no longer preventive action in the standards, because you were supposed to have thought that through with risk-based thought. Now, does that mean there has to be a risk tool? Nope. It's not a requirement. There is no record required for risk. Makes sense to have one. Okay? And if you're on the 14,001 side, there is a requirement. So let me take a step back. So 9,001, not a requirement. 14,001, there's a requirement. Okay? But along those lines, it's still based on the structure that you are as an organization. If you go back to that flow chart that I showed you a few minutes ago, that flow chart is to help you understand the way that you function or act as an organization. That's what it's for. So as much as you might say, all I care about is 14,001, your point of reference is the activities that are performed day in and day out. So you should think in terms of those activities and blend it in. So if by chance you're sitting there and you're the 14,001 or you're the 18,001 folks, and you're going, we bow to no one. That's why we're 14,001 or we're 18,001. It's not bowing. It's thinking about things the way they operate. Because if you make it a reflection of the organization, they don't have any excuses why they won't live it. Okay? So that's the cycle of thought that you need to go through. But that risk component, that risks and opportunities. Risks, something's already a risk. Opportunity, the inevitability or concern that it may exist, is what drives you down that path. Okay?
And what do you think of the management of change element? Because we were audited last week, one of the auditors made a big deal about the management of change.
It was there already. Okay, so if you look at what the management of change was talking about, in 9001 it was 5.4.2 A and B. Okay, so in other words, if you go back to ISO 9001, 2008, you can look at 5.4.2 A and B. 5.4.2 A and B of 9001, 2008. Because if you read, it's still talking about the same types of things. The integrity of the management system is maintained. The activity is planned. It's just now, instead of it just being this thing that's off to the side, it's actually there. The planning of changes is actually you simply saying, I'm about to do something. So if you think back to the kaleidoscope, if you thought in terms of that kaleidoscope and your risks and opportunities, okay? So in other words, what is my starting point with risks and opportunities? Okay, what is my current structure or state of existence with regard to competence, definition, control? Okay, what am I about to change? Where most people get in trouble is they don't know, they think they know who they are before they institute change instead of they know. Okay, I've got one, 3 years before a company made this particular change. I was there working with them, and this company at that particular point was $250 million, I think was what they were. Today, they're just under $1 billion. Okay? But at that particular point, I'm going through working with them as an organization, and at this point, on this day, I'm doing an audit. Well, they say, well, hey, we want to show you what we're going to. So they show me what they're going to. It's an update to their system, and it's an open platform that they're going to be using. And they take me over, and I ask them, I said, so I don't see anywhere in here with what you guys have mapped with regard to where you're heading, where you started with the point of reference of who you are today. And the guy that was there, he goes, before I came into this position, I was the plant manager. I know exactly who we are. I don't need that stuff. I know what we do, okay? They go through this process. They spend $1 million getting this thing in play, getting it ready to go. They turn it on. And I just so happened to be there the week that they turned it on. And the guy who was the vice president of quality said to me, he goes, I'm not going to really have time to work with you today, but I do need you to go chase some things for me. Go chase these things, and I'll talk to you at lunch. Okay? That particular point. I come back at lunch, talk to him about what the thing is. He's, yeah. Because I don't have a whole lot of time. Right now, we are processing orders through, and we're having to do them all manually. Okay? This company has sites all over the world. And at this particular point, all of the managers are having to take orders from this system at this portion. And once it finishes, they have to print the stuff out and take it over to the next place to enter it in, because the connection between those two activities was missing. And it wasn't just that spot. It was all over. Okay? And they've been doing this for 2 weeks, and it took them a while to do it. It cost them well more than the $1 million that the plan they put in place.
Because they didn't do the management of change.
Because they didn't facilitate the change. They didn't evaluate things through that structure. So if you think back to that flow chart, what's happening at that particular point is you're saying, I'm going to have to manage a change. You move back over to the left-hand side of the flow. So again, day in and day out, you're working off the right-hand side. All of a sudden, there's a need to change something. You're on the left-hand side, and you're now dealing with what are the dynamics that have occurred? How did it change scope and context? What kind of new risks or opportunities are now going to be realized as a result of this thing? And your starting point, though, has to be, what are you currently doing? Not what do you think you're doing, but what does the evidence about what you're doing tell you? That's the significance of your internal audits. Okay? Because if you're doing a good job with your audits, you know whether or not what's there is true or not. And you're dealing with what's there through management or changes, okay? In other words, it can happen as a result of audits, corrective actions, those things. But it can also happen because at management review, you guys say we're going in a different direction, new type of service, things like that. Okay? Anything else?
Thank you.
Going once, going twice? That's it. All right, here we go, there we go. Okay.
Well, Robert, thank you for joining us this
Yep.
afternoon. If ever you have any questions and want to send that email to Robert, just get with me, and I'll be more than happy to forward it on to you. Robert, it's always been a pleasure working with you, talking with you. Really
Yep.
appreciate that you took the afternoon to
Yep.
be in town to come and talk with us. But thank you guys for joining us this afternoon and coming to the workshop and learning a little bit more about ISO 9001 and 14001. So, with that, put this knowledge to good use as you're looking forward to 2015. And let's get busy. We've got a lot of work to do still, but we're getting there. We're making progress. Yes, sir.
Are there any follow-ups to this conversation? Will there be other conversations about it?
Well, you know, in my trainings, we're always talking about this, so you're always welcome to come to my trainings. Who knows, maybe I'll be able to convince Robert to come back and give us another session in regards to the 2015. If he's in town, he's kind of hard to catch up with these days, but that's always an opportunity there.
And what's the weather today? It's gonna be real bad, between 4 and 9.
Yeah, so get you guys out of here. All right, drive safe, have fun, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.